We mentioned earlier that the federal government has struck a deal with the opposition on management of the referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Let's find out more about the actual logistics of the process and welcome Professor Kim Rubenstein, a constitutional and citizenship law expert. Welcome to you.
Thanks, Kirsten.
It has been a while since we've gone through a referendum campaign. Some people who'll be voting in this one hadn't even been born at the time of the last one. So let's talk a little about how it will work. When will the campaign proper kick off?
So it depends on the passage of the legislation that's before Parliament or about to be introduced into Parliament in terms of the wording, the actual proposed law to alter the Constitution. But I should also say that this morning I began the day 8 hours ago speaking to the National Schools Constitutional Convention at Old Parliament House, where over 200 Year 11 students from all around the country came to ask these very questions and to look at the Constitution. And it really does come back to this Constitution, which I had with me this morning, talking to them about in terms of the timing. So a proposed law has to be passed by both houses of the Parliament. And we haven't seen that proposed law yet, but there is discussion that we should see it before the end of this sitting. And once that proposed law is introduced and passed by both houses of Parliament, then not less than 2 months, but not more than 6 months after that law is passed by both houses, we will have the actual referendum being held.
Now, I don't believe that those Year 11s, as interested as they may be, will be eligible, or most of them, to vote in this referendum. Who will be eligible, and is voting compulsory?
That's a very important point. So, first of all, voting in Australia is governed by the Electoral Act, and it's actually the combination of the Electoral Act and the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act that set out those requirements. So you have to be 18 years of age as an Australian citizen enrolled on the electoral roll. I should add, actually, there are some British subjects who are still on the electoral roll from before 1987 who will also be able to vote. But in essence, it's the same as in a federal election with the requirements for enrolment, and anyone who is enrolled will be obliged to vote at the as part of the referendum.
We know that a national neutral civics campaign will be run. What do you believe Australians need to know about making changes to our Constitution? What do we need to learn?
Well, this is actually something that I spoke about a lot more this morning to the students, because the Constitution was framed in the 1890s. And in fact, there were students from all around the country with a very multicultural breadth showing there, and a lot of women. And in the 1890s, there were no women as drafters, even though Catherine Helen Spence had tried, because in South Australia she had been eligible to vote because of the South Australian laws enabling women to vote from 1894. And she'd actually run to be a member of the convention, but she didn't quite get there. But there were no women, there were no Indigenous Australians. There were largely white British subject men who devised this Constitution. And there are many structural positives, obviously, about it, but it doesn't reflect the nature of our community today. And one of the important starting points is, of course, recognition of the Indigenous Australians, First Nations people who were there right from the start and who have never been acknowledged. So this is one part of the change that is important. But there are other aspects of our society today that are not recognised in our Constitution. And if we move forward positively with this voice alteration to the Constitution, then I think we'll be healthier as a society to really engage in other constitutional change that is important for the health and well-being of the nation.
Those voting in the referendum can look forward to receiving an official pamphlet outlining the yes and no cases. The views of crossbenchers and the Greens won't be included in that pamphlet. Is that in keeping with past referenda, that it is strictly the yes and no cases that are explained to voters?
So historically, yes, that's right. And those Referendum Machinery Provisions Act regulations express the framework for setting up a yes and no case. And there was a lot of discussion and impetus to actually minimise the framework for such an adversarial approach. In fact, one of the things I also discussed this morning with the students was that we are caught in a very partisan framework in our public policy that really needs addressing in terms of positive policy changes. And so there were many who were suggesting that it was important to make this as bipartisan as possible. And perhaps these changes to the referendum machinery provisions that have been agreed to will assist with that bipartisan approach. But I think it's really important to highlight, particularly for this Uluru Statement from the Heart process, which was so active in its engagement of Indigenous citizens around Australia, of asking them what it was that First Nations people wanted from the Constitution, engaging them as active citizens, and in many ways role modelling for all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, how important it is to re-engage with this document and to say that we want something that better reflects the nature of Australian society today. And I think if that message comes through in that public information about how important it is for the Constitution, which is really like the roots of the nation in terms of the foundation to all of the laws that flow from the Constitution, that this is a real opportunity and generous invitation in terms of Indigenous Australians, asking Australians to walk with them in making the Constitution reflect its history in a more significant way that better represents Indigenous Australians and their involvement in laws that actually impact on them.
But many have expressed that this will be a challenge. Not many referenda in Australia have been carried when you look at the total number that has been put to the Australian people. So if we talk about the actual day itself, which we believe will look much like a federal election in Australia,
Indeed.
perhaps even with sausage sizzles, how will we know whether the referendum has been carried after people have gone into the polling place and marked their paper with a yes or a no?
So first of all, I think some of the amendments to the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act is enabling more people to put in a postal vote. And so if that passes and there are greater provisions for postal voting, then that may factor into how long it is before we know the outcome of the vote. But this Section 128 says that you need to have a majority of people in a majority of states. And again, this is something I explained this morning. This is part of the Federal Compact. At the time of Federation, we had different colonies coming together to agree on a national constitution. And so the states added in this requirement that it not only be a majority of people throughout the nation, but that a majority of states had to also pass the referendum change. So this weights our federal system to give greater, power to the states in terms of the influence on their outcome. And so this is something that the Year 11 students were actually looking at today. Should we be looking at changing the provisions in Section 128 to make it perhaps a simple majority rather than giving the states so much power over the outcome? Let's hope that we do get the majority of people in a majority of states so that we don't have to address that own constitutional change in Section 128 itself. But it is a double requirement. And each person who goes in to vote, well, here I am sitting in the ACT. So my vote in the ACT in the Northern Territory only counts towards the majority of the nation, whereas each of the people in the states are part of both hurdles, a majority of people in a majority of states.
Well, we are edging closer to people over the age of 18 and eligible to vote having their say. Professor Kim Rubenstein, great to speak to you. We will speak to you again before the big day.
Looking forward to it.